Hey everyone, so I've still got this goddamn cold, so if I sound like I'm bunged up, it's because I'm bunged up. But I've been doing a lot of thinking of late, and I was watching a Jordan Peterson video where he's giving a lecture on Marxism and postmodernism. And that got me thinking about the criticisms the Marxists and postmodernists have of his understanding of Marxism and postmodernism. I watched some of the sort of like new lefty channels, like Three Arrows and another one. I can't remember the name of it. I think it was something Cuck. But they were complaining about Jordan Peterson misrepresenting postmodernist and Marxist analysis. And in a way, it looks like he is. And so I thought I'd dig into it and actually have a think about the components of what makes them what they are. Because I've also been reading Falguni Sheth recently, who's a postmodernist herself, who leans heavily on Foucault, you're welcome, ContraPoints, and Derrida. I haven't actually read Foucault and Derrida directly, but I think I can gather the thrust of what they're saying from Sheth's writing, because I think Sheth is accurately representing them. Initially, really, it comes down to the legitimacy of values. And the Marxist meta-narrative is historical materialism, as in the material conditions of people give rise to classes that, in Hegel's dialectical view, form the antithesis within them, coming into violent contact, producing the synthesis of these ideas into the new status quo, which in and of itself produces its own antithesis through its imperfections, and this gives rise to all ideas throughout history, and that's one way of looking at it. Then you've got the liberal meta-narrative, which is about the enlightenment and emancipation of mankind, as in the individual, the liberation of the person from oppressive structures above them, and conceiving of society in a far more Darwinian way, that society changes naturally over time with the actions of individuals, which is obviously in contrast to the Marxist meta-narrative. And then you have the postmodernist meta-narrative, or lack thereof, because postmodernism is a rejection of meta-narratives, claiming that they give no legitimacy to the worldview that they're promoting. And that's the difference between... that's the similarity between Marxism and liberalism there, is that they do have a meta-narrative that gives legitimacy to the series of values that are being proposed and the legitimacy of the worldview, whereas postmodernism just rejects that entirely. And so the postmodernists are not wrong to say that they are not compatible with Marxism in that way, but that's not the only aspect of the prism that is a postmodernist analysis and a Marxist analysis and liberal analysis. We'll go on to the power analysis next. Now, power analysis is literally, as it says, is how power is distributed in society and how this power is exercised and the legitimacy with which this power is used. And that comes from the legitimacy of the values. So in a postmodernist meta-narrative, lack of meta-narrative, it means that power is very difficult to justify. Whereas in a liberal or Marxist power analysis, meta-narrative, it's actually remarkably easy to justify. And so, and honestly, I'm not saying any one of these is right or wrong either. I am a liberal, so I'll explain that later, but this is just me trying to give an honest analysis and accounting of what I'm seeing. So, for example, in a Marxist power analysis, it's all about class power, obviously, relation to the means of production. They believe that there is a class of people who own the means of production called the capitalists, the ones who have capital, and that they are forever exploiting the workers who cannot have capital. This isn't true, really. This is a basic bitch analysis of anything. And in fact, a liberal analysis, which is of individual power, actually debunks a Marxist class analysis. It's not to say that there is no legitimacy to a class analysis. It's that it's more like looking at, it's like looking through a frosted glass. You can see a vague shape on the other side, and a liberal analysis is like looking through a clear glass. You can see the details of the shape on the other side. And so the Marxist analysis is inherently collectivist, the liberal one is inherently individualist, and this gives them different strengths and weaknesses. The weakness of the Marxist power analysis is that it doesn't check power very well. It's very difficult to hold power to account because you're doing it for the greater good. And so often it's totally justified. Whereas liberalism is really good at restraining power. Is there an individual that's suffering because of what you're doing? Well, good God, you're going to have to justify that. You know, it's very, very good at restraining power. In fact, the point of liberalism is to prevent tyranny. That's the overarching point of the whole philosophy, is to inhibit tyrants. And it does an amazing job of that. You know, look at the English-speaking liberal countries. They don't produce tyrants. And so it does what it's supposed to do, and it makes the majority of people wealthy. Liberalism grows the middle class. Marxism grows the working class. Which one would you rather be in? But then a postmodernist power analysis. Now, I probably don't have the correct academic toolkit with which to talk about this. There are undoubtedly correct words that they use, but I'm going to use ones that hopefully can be understood to mean the same thing, because I'm sure there's already terms for what I'm going to be saying. But so a postmodernist power analysis is all based on sovereign power. It's based on the seat of power in a society. So this comes in their view as the sovereign. This is different to liberal power analysis, obviously, which is, I mean, it does include within it a class analysis and a sovereign analysis, but it's always relative and in relation to what the individual can do. As in, can the individual become the head of state? If the answer is no, we have a hereditary monarchy, then that's something that liberalism picks up on, because it comes inherent with the system of values. But we'll get to this in a minute, because there's a lot here that I've had to think about a lot. So the postmodernist power analysis is also a class power analysis. The sovereign does not have to be one person. In fact, it can be, it could be anything. And I think that this is why the Marxists ultimately found it easy to transition into. We're talking about the French intellectuals of the 70s, and they came out of Marxism. I can't tell you why, but I know they did. And I think that the fact that they used to be Marxists, and they still have a Marxist sort of analysis of power, is why people mistake postmodernists for Marxists. I think that's the reason. Because they are essentially doing the same thing, just centering what they consider to be the source of power in a different location, but still doing a class power analysis rather than an individual one. Okay, and so lastly, I want to talk about the kind of, and I don't have the right terms for these, but the sort of method of categorization, the method of dividing up the world and viewing the world. And in Marxist and liberal worldviews, these are done with a system of values, which is, in my opinion, the correct way to do something if you're trying to organize human beings, because otherwise you'll end up with a system that might not have any values at all, which is what, as far as I can tell, the postmodernist system is. The Marxist categorization of groups of people is entirely relative. It's relative to the means of production, and each class is relative to one another in this hierarchy. The liberal categorization is universal. Each person has the same value, at least in relation to the polity. As the being of a citizen, you don't actually have any more value. Your vote carries the same weight as everyone else's vote. And so this allows for a kind of depolitical life, where you get to be yourself away from you, the citizen. And you can use this to improve the odds of your particular party winning by persuading other citizens and whatnot, blah, blah, blah. So it's a universal form of categorization, but it's still subjective because it still contains within it a system of values. And again, I think that that's a necessary thing, because the postmodernist categorization it's very objective, in my opinion. It's very objective, and because it's not about the importance. There are no values inherent in it, because I think of the rejection of meta-narratives, because the meta-narrative is what gives a system of values legitimacy. And if you reject meta-narratives, then you can't have a system of values that are legitimate. And so, or at least, if you can, I haven't figured out a way of making that happen, and I don't think anyone else has either, to be honest. And so a postmodernist categorization is objective without value, and so everything is as legitimate as the other things. even if from a subjective view of, say, a human, rather than a more objective view of, say, the state or the sovereign power, or even as like a class representative, a postmodernist analysis and deconstruction and recategorization is not necessarily advantageous for you. And I think it's this that's causing the confusion with people and Jordan Peterson. I mean, when people call them neo-Marxists, I don't think that's wrong. I think they are neo-Marxists. But that doesn't mean that they are Marxists. Marxists are actually different to neo-Marxists, but they do have the same power analysis. It is one of class power, and it has no room for individual agency. It is still a class analysis, it's just that one has value and one doesn't have values. And if Falguni Sheth is anyone to go by on this, it's because the state has one goal. The sovereign power has one goal, and that is to maintain its own sovereignty. So the effective living conditions or the values of the populations to be ruled over, because everything is viewed in terms of populations. And I tell you what, as a strategy game player, it made reading postmodernism was really easy because I have a really good background in military history and power tactics. So it was very easy to understand what the postmodernists were trying to say. And I can see that someone who didn't spend their time reading Thucydides or reading, about Hannibal or Caesar or Clausewitz or Sun Tzu or Machiavelli, people who don't read all of these things could well find themselves not really well understanding postmodernists. And I don't blame people. It's difficult. But it just so happens I think I'm really relatively well prepared for this conversation, because you do when you're reading about history, you can't help but not really give a shit about the people involved. Something that happened thousands of years ago to people you are not in any way related to, even genetically or through identity, where you have no investment in who wins either way. You can't help but form an objective analysis because you haven't got a preference. And so you do end up categorizing things by the position of sovereign power in relation to populations that need to be managed. For example, looking at the Roman Empire's dealing with the Goths and the other Germanic refugees and invaders into the Western Roman Empire. You can't help but categorize it that way because you don't have the ability to talk to the individuals involved. You've probably got sort of like, scraps of notes and whatnot that were left from the time, but nothing comprehensive. Whereas you can see exactly through records what the state did and through archaeological evidence. So it's easier to do a postmodernist style analysis of history, as in removing values, because it's not like your values even apply to them anyway. So it becomes a lot easier to understand. And I think that this is the key to a postmodernist analysis, but I also think this is the weakness of a postmodernist analysis, because at the end of the day, it doesn't take into account the actual problems and requirements of the people living in these societies. If it breaks everything down to be of an equal value, which is effectively zero, then okay, you can say that, but it doesn't take into account human suffering. It doesn't take into account things that are actually impacting on people. And then it's just to the postmodernists themselves to impose their own system of values on it. And that's all well and good, but where are you deriving your system of values from? It becomes very subjective. And so it's taking an objective analysis and applying a subjective, just basically a feels to it. For example, Falguni Sheth, one of the things that drove me nuts towards political philosophy of race, she uses Muslims as the quote-unquote racialized people who are to be oppressed by liberal society. She never gives an analysis of her own of Muslim society and what it's doing to the people within it. It's actually just apologies for Muslim society, as in Islamic women choose to wear veils and burqas and abayas because it protects them from the evil outside forces and it's a way of self-empowerment. It's like, okay, but your problem with Western societies are the evil outside forces, and you're just fine with the evil outside forces in Islamic societies because, ultimately you would be forced to do a value judgment between them because they're not the fucking same. One is far worse than another. One is eminently tolerable, and one is really intolerable, in my opinion. But I mean, I'm not a Muslim woman. Maybe it's completely tolerable to be treated like cattle and bundled up like a fucking body, ready to be thrown in a river. Who knows? But the point I'm trying to get to is, I think this is the root of people's misunderstanding with Jordan Peterson. Now, I haven't run this by him or anything like this, and this is just through my own reading that I have come to these conclusions, but I've been doing a lot of reading, I've been doing a lot of thinking, and if you disagree, tell me why. I don't just like dismiss. Explain to me what your reasoning is, because you might be wrong and I might be right, or I might be wrong and you might be right, and I genuinely want to find the truth of what we're saying here, because it's a very complex subject, and it's got very tribal. And that means that it's very difficult to find any truth from it. And I've been working very hard to actually try and establish what is the correctness of what's happening. And I would like people to help me along with that. Thank you.